The Local Government Amendment Bill appeared to be a largely uncontroversial piece of legislation, providing updates and improvements to the acts which allow commissioners and councillors to deliver services to us, the ratepayers. Uncontroversial until Lawrie Hooper tried to introduce 3 new clauses which significantly alter the relationship between central and local government. We'll hear later from Chris Thomas, MHK, who's been stirring this political pot, but first, DOI Minister Michelle Haywood. What does seem to have happened is a very significant polarisation of the relationship between local government and the department, by the department now suggesting that actually no, it's fine. We'll introduce some of these clauses. One new clause that's been rejected by Keys is to be introduced into LegCo. It seems a very unusual way to introduce quite significant legislation in relation to local government.
Yeah, so I think it's an unfortunate element of timing that Mr Hooper had the amendment drafted up before he was invited to join the department, and so by the time it came to discussing it, he was in the department, but it was drawn up when he was a backbencher. Mr Hooper in particular is very passionate about local authorities making sure that they do what their constituents are expecting them to do, and they deliver on the services that they want to deliver on. The rest of the Local Government Amendments Act or Bill, as you know, has been years in the making. It tidies up a number of things, and it was widely consulted on back on my time on the commissioners, and probably by you as minister at the time. So that bit is non-contentious, and I kind of reject the local authorities saying we didn't know anything about this bill. They collectively did. Maybe their collective memory is not quite as good as it should be in this case, but they were widely consulted at the time. So parliamentary procedure really catches us on this one, because Mr Hooper brings a backbench amendment, which he's got the right to do, and in fact which any member could have done, to bring in the powers under the new clause 1 as it's known, which basically means that we could make services that aren't currently statutory services, we could make those mandatory for local authorities after we consulted with them and with the approval of Tynwald. Now that's important because there are a number of things that I suspect constituents know that the local authorities provide, but they don't know what footing that's on. For example, amenity sites. There's no statutory requirement for local authorities to provide amenity sites. They do. There's a statutory requirement under the Public Health Act to deal with household waste, and they do. But you start getting some services that fall between the gaps over what's statutory and what's custom and practice. And so what new clause 1 gives us the ability to do is say, well, that service that you've been providing anyway, we do think we're going to make it mandatory, and we do think we're going to oblige you to carry on providing it. And there'll be services, talk about amenity sites, there'll be services that we consider that the population expect and deserve and need, which are currently local authority services. So we have to consult, we'd have to take it to Tynwald for approval, and then we could make those services mandatory, and then local authorities would be obliged to deliver those services.
You've mentioned amenity sites several times in that answer. Does that give us a hint as to where this particular or the department's newfound desire to accept these amendments, where that's coming from?
A little, but I think there's other issues. So we've seen when we were talking about swimming pool rates, and we've seen local authorities being out of step with each other over supporting swimming pools, and so I think there are a number of things that historically local authorities have been involved in that give us cause for concern. So I think it is a sensible measure to tidy up the bill. There are certain things that we need to have. If we don't have amenity sites that are open and available, we will see a massive increase in fly tipping. That becomes everyone's problem.
It's certainly an interesting position where, effectively, as a government bill, you're saying to LegCo, hang fire on consideration of this. So this is government telling LegCo to hang fire on consideration. I think that's unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, so the clause that didn't go through in the House of Keys, I think there was perhaps a little bit of misunderstanding, and it should have been supported because the department, when they evaluated, did think that it was a sensible addition to have. It's about the service, the level of service being provided, and so it was a useful adjunct to new clause 1. So when we discussed it afterwards, we thought, well, we can ask Legco to consider introducing that clause back. Now, so I've taken the decision that as Minister, because I'm then supporting something coming through, I'm obliged to then consult about it. So we couldn't consult on new clause 1 because it was a backbench amendment, but if we are moving new clause 2 and supporting that through, and asking Legco to consider that, I think it was the right thing to do. So that's gone out to local authorities for a very short consultation, and I know the period feels very short, 6 weeks. However, the local authorities have known about new clause 1 and new clause 2 now for some weeks because Mr Thomas very helpfully wrote to all of them as things were evolving in the Keys in order to share that information. So I know, because I've had correspondence from local authorities, they've already considered it, and my 6-week period is really to ask those that haven't yet considered the implications of it to think about it and let me know what they think.
Wouldn't it have been better to wait until after the local authority elections were out of the way?
I think part of the problem with this bill is that because we keep going through election cycles and we don't nail it down, that when you get a new cohort of commissioners coming in, we will have to allow them then some time in order to catch up with where things are and what's going on. And I think that would delay progress. And so given that I already have expressions of interest, concern and comments from the existing commissioners, I'll work with them because that would be my quickest route. I know that they already understand what's going on. And so rather than foisting it onto new commissioners and expecting them to get up to speed, I want to move on ahead with this bill. It's been years in the making, and so I want to do that at some pace. But I'm comfortable that because everyone already knows about the clauses, that we can do that in time.
Well, that was the case for the department, calmly put by DOI Minister Michelle Haywood MHK. Next up, Douglas Central MHK Chris Thomas. Particularly, I think your concern was over the new amendments proposed by Lawrie Hooper. Surely to goodness it's not unreasonable if government delegates certain functions to a local authority that there is some ability to issue penalties against that authority if it fails to deliver the service.
If that's what this is about, it could be about many other things. You've assumed it's something perhaps to do with the Highways Charter, but it could also be to do with a civic amenities site, it could be to do with libraries, it could be to do with recycling more generally, all sorts of things it could be about, and that's one of the issues. The second issue is that we now have basically two important topics wrapped up in one piece of legislation. One of those topics is a bill that started in 2021, got through the House of Keys, then there was a general election and the Legislative Council refused to take it, so I had to start it again 2 years later in 2023, and now we're in a situation where government appears to be instructing the Legislative Council to pause while they go out and rethink and consult about a controversial aspect. And we have to remember that first part goes all the way back to 2011 when MLCs, Mr Turner at the time, and I think it was Mr Ronan and Mr Cragine, who were in the House of Keys, had a select committee on what was called the sort of Onken Squash Courts fallout about behaviours and conduct of councillors. So there's that, and I'm very worried that we'll derail again something that's been kicking around since 2011. And then there's this new bigger topic which Mr Hooper, probably supported by Dr Haywood, because they're both in the Department of Infrastructure, one at Minister and one at Department.
It's definitely more than probably now, isn't it? Because the new clauses that Mr Hooper was proposing, which initially, when it was going through Keys, were described as private members' clauses, and he had every right to introduce them. Subsequently, they've now become government clauses, and this is why there's been the delay in terms of the bill going from Keys to Legco.
That's all
because
true,
these are government now government clauses, despite the fact that the Keys defeated one of those clauses.
Exactly. So we've politicised the Legislative Council, which is beginning to be a sort of minor constitutional issue. And secondly, government is now determining what the Legislative Council does, apparently, presumably operating through the departmental member from the Legislative Council, and that's not right.
Yeah, government can't do that, can they? I mean, effectively, this is a department bill.
Mm-hmm.
The clauses may not be or may not have originated from the department, but the bill itself did originate from the department. So it's not unreasonable for the department to say to its department member who's taking the bill through in LegCo, can you hang on a bit, because we want to do a brief consultation on a few new clauses.
But they weren't. They were private members' clauses that were defeated in the House of Keys, and we're getting into that. That's what Legislative Council did to me twice previously. They refused collectively, Legislative Council refused to take the bill through Legislative Council because at the time a couple of ministers, Mr Hooper and Mrs Lord Brennan, had clauses they wanted to introduce and that sort of thing. And now we've got this new supposedly backbench clause that goes right to the heart of the relationship between local authorities and delegated functions from government authorities, and who pays what for what services in different areas. So that's the second issue, and the two of them have been mixed up. We've got a bill that's been kicking around since 2011 for 12 years or so, even in its legal form, and now we've got a more controversial area, and both of those have been mixed up. And what the inevitable consequence will be is that the bill itself, the main part of the bill, which is about some really important issues like codes of conduct, like the public sector pensions, like expenses, like how bylaws are made, that's being held up now through a bold, potentially brilliant, but definitely reckless attempt to reform rates and local government and the carrying out of functions that traditionally local authorities and housing authorities in the various parts of the island have done.
But this is always the risk of an amendment bill, isn't it? I mean, if you bring forward an amendment bill which in essence, with this bill, it is open-ended to anything connected to local government and local government legislation. Yeah. Any member of the House of Keys, or indeed LegCo, can introduce new clauses, and that's always the risk a minister takes by bringing an amendment bill like this, which has lots and lots of elements to it.
And that's why the headline for me has been the Keys and government have let themselves down in respect to this amendment, supposedly from a backbencher called Mr Hooper, who also happens to be in the Department of Infrastructure that's responsible for local governments, because in essence they were warned, I warned them, that this would be perceived eventually by local authorities as being an attack and an uncertain something that didn't have a certain consequences and certain meaning, and it has been perceived like that. Admittedly, I brought it to the local authorities' attention, and so that we are in that situation now. What we actually needed, you and I know this from our days working 10 years ago in local authority reform, is you need a consensus to get things to change. You need to have clarity about what is changing, and we've now got government and Keys who've let themselves down, who've seemed to be asking Legislative Council to let them have a consultation before Legislative Council carries on, which is immediately putting in, I think it's probably Miss Kinnish, the departmental member, from in a difficult position. They'll have to find another of the new MLCs now to come in and move the amendments the government now want to be moved, because it's become a government initiative. And you have to say, what's the point of the Legislative Council then if it's not actually an independent scrutiny body? It's just actually where government gets its amendments done through the back door after Keys has considered them. And then you have to start saying, from a local authority point of view, is government just telling us what to do, and they're not even talking to us about how we're going to pay for it, whether it's ratepayer money or taxpayer money? Because some of these functions we're talking about used to be paid for from taxpayer money, so particularly in rural areas under part of the Rates Act. DUI can get Treasury concurrence to have payments to provide some of these functions. That hasn't happened. Mr Tier took that away when he was Treasury Minister by and large. But, so therefore we're looking at the ratepayers paying things. And then the question is, if the DUI wants to get the power to fine local authorities not to, for the standards, why shouldn't local authorities have the power to fine DOI for not having carried out the functions that it has legal responsibility for the last 10 years properly? If the hedges haven't been cut properly in the northern parishes or in the rural areas out west or whatever, why can't the local authorities through the ratepayers come back and have a go at to see if they can get the grievance settled against the government in the similar way that government's now proposing against them?
And I think it's fair to declare interest here. First of all, I was DOI minister that initiated some reforms, particularly in relation to highway services, and now, of course, I'm a clerk to a local authority. And it is fair to say that had the minister, Mr. Hooper, wished to find a mechanism to completely polarise the argument, I don't think they could have done a better job than what's happened here, because we now have a big meeting of local authorities due to take place. That the local authorities are, as you have described, up in arms about this. But is it not fair to say that certain local authorities perhaps haven't met the obligations that they signed up to back in 2015-16 when we delegated those services to them in DOI? Some local authorities have done an excellent job, others have done a pretty poor job, and is it not unreasonable for the department then to say, well, actually, maybe we do need some kind of provision to allow us to put some kind of penalty on local authorities that don't perform?
Putting a penalty on, and perhaps even making commissioners liable personally, is quite a long way down the track. The first thing you have to do is have standards agreed, and that hasn't happened in respect of the highways, although the Minister of Infrastructure has asserted it has happened. I don't think it has. From what I've heard, the standards are disputed in different ways.
You were at the meeting
I was
that
at
the
the
local
meeting, and it certainly seemed to me that they were disputed. And even so, there are mechanisms already to impose those to decide what those standards are and to enforce those standards. What
is the mechanism? What can the department do if I won't pick on any particular authority, but an authority has muck piled high on the streets and no obvious plan to do any sweeping or tidying? What functions, because this is a function, cleaning highways is effectively one of the functions delegated to local authorities. What penalty can the department impose, or what sanction can it take?
It can take the function back, so it doesn't have to delegate them to the local authority.
But when that delegation took place, there was it was a quid pro quo. On the one hand, you won't have to pay the extra gate fee at the incinerator, which was effectively added across the whole island, came up to about £1 million, and the cost that the department was transferring to local authorities was about £1 million.
Yeah.
So if you hand the service back, if the service goes back to DOI, surely DOI then has the right to impose the charge that was part of through part of that agreement had been waived.
And I do hope that the department's looked at the simpler version of actually doing the service itself and charging it to ratepayers, because it seems to me at first sight, and I've put a written question down to establish that there might be a mechanism for the department to do it and charge it to ratepayers. But we're not addressing the other question, which is, should it be taxpayers or should it be ratepayers that pay for this? Because the highways legislation is quite clear. It's a function of central government. So as a Douglas ratepayer, should I not be really annoyed that I've been paying rates to Douglas City Council to provide services that I could have forced the Department of Infrastructure to provide inside Douglas? Is it just not I don't know what's the word, just Douglas being sort of so self-centred to think it has to do the function when it could have got the functions carried out by the DOI with the taxpayer paying it?
And that's how it used to be. The department paid the Douglas Borough Council, as it was then, City Council now, to undertake street cleaning functions.
So your conference is really good, because there will be people there, because clerks have long memories, who can remind people that we've got to settle how this is going to be paid for. go back and look at the standards in different areas. But the basic problem we have now is that in 2021, one of the Chief Minister candidates, Dr. Allinson, said he would reform rates within the first 100 days. He lost. Mr. Cannon, representing the northern parishes, which have the lowest rates on the island, and we have places like Bride that haven't put up their rates for years because they have a huge non-domestic rateable value from the currents.
You mentioned
Bride.
So
therefore, basically, the government's policy since 2021 has been no local government reform and no rates reform. And effectively, Mr. Hooper's amendment at the last minute, without having mentioned it at second reading, it's now pushed us into the realms of local government reform and rates reform. That's why I say it's bold, potentially brilliant, but definitely at the moment reckless, because we're now in a situation where the local authorities are all meeting together at the same conference, and they're asking me for ideas how to get out of this mess, and that's what you and I are talking about today.
Interestingly, Keys members seem to have a kind of a schizophrenic approach to the Legislative Council. On the one hand, they are very clear that it's purely a scrutinising body. It's not there to make policy. Mm-hmm. And yet, on the other hand, as I've been saying in all the interviews with LegCo candidates, you vote in Tynwald on policy and finance. So if the first element of this, if it is the case that Keys believe that major policy should not be being moved by Legislative Council, it does seem quite bizarre that a fairly significant piece of legislation, such as these proposed new amendments, that have one of which has been rejected by Keys, is then going to be introduced in Legislative Council.
Exactly, and that's why I said very clearly in front of my Keys members, and only one other person got it and voted against the new clause, and this is even after I'd amended the new clause to make it better. Two of us voted against it, and that's the point I made. What we should have now is we should vote against this new clause and bring it back as part of Local Government Amendment Bill 2 in 2025, 2026, after it had been thought through, because Mrs. Lord Brennan made another speech to say that she was very disappointed because she'd spent a year as Cabinet Office Minister working with the then DOI Minister, Mr. Crookall, her constituency colleague, to come up with a mechanism to be able to, for commissioners, somehow to performance manage the clerk, and also for the commissioners to have to make public their financial plans, more specific financial plans than they had done in the past.
That can happen anyway. I mean, the performance management of a clerk is basically the commissioners decide what the contract is, mm-hmm. and surely, to goodness.
Well, it seemed like from her speech she wanted it in law, in statute. Mm. So what I'm saying, and also that in various parts of the island, the MHK seem to be working with commissioners because they want more sanctions against commissioners for doing certain things, and also.
And then, of course, you end up in the position of saying, well, why don't we just have one Department of Government doing all this? Because if you're going to take all that responsibility in relation to commissioners making decisions, democratically elected commissioners making decisions on behalf of their people, if central government can then place sanction if they don't like what the commissioners decide, you kind of wonder what the point of having the local authorities there for.
Exactly, and that, if you remember, the scope and structure of government reports all those years ago, 15 years ago, or whatever it was, had that as their proposal. There was a transition mechanism with that sort of idea behind it, and then we moved towards the idea of regional authorities. And I think that's what I like to look forward rather than back. Let's stop criticising Mr. Hooper, because ultimately his amendment was bold, potentially brilliant, and certainly reckless. But it has encouraged this debate about the future of local authorities. So I've tried to get hold of this now by making sure that the local authorities knew about it. You've given me some great news today that there's a conference amongst local authorities to have positive input. I've put down a motion on the March Tynwald order paper with a provocative title of "After the 2025 general election of local authorities, regional government into the 2030s, and it's a general debate. There's nothing that will be resolved, but I'm hoping that this will draw government out. This will draw members out of from around the island. I'm hoping that I'm writing to commissioners this weekend to ask them to tell their MHKs what they want said locally, and I'm hoping that we have that itself will help in this debate. And wouldn't it be great if the new candidates for the local commissioners got hold of some of these arguments? And wouldn't it be great if we could carry on the momentum after the election to get back the energy that I think was there back in 2013, 14, 15, 16, and many times before that over the last 20 years, so we can have proper local authority reform alongside rates reform. And my big contribution that I want to be heard is that we shouldn't think about a local authority per se. What we need to think about is the best way to handle housing, and the best way to handle waste management, and the best way to handle highways functions, and the best way to handle cultural and sporting things, and the best way to handle speed limits, 20 mile per hour speed limits, because we've just learned that there's going to be an order, an all-island 20 mile per hour speed limit order. And if you see some of the maps, every road in every town district, village district is going to have a default 20 mile per hour speed limit on it. So that's going to be controversial. So, hopefully my motion, your conference, we've restarted that debate. Mr. Cannon, the Chief Minister, didn't get his way, and this 21-26 administration is not devoid of initiative. It's just coming right at the end, because we've got so much to do that we could have done in a better way, but at least it started now, and we've now got to optimise the way that we make these decisions about these functions.
That was former DOI Minister Chris Thomas. So what do you think? Is it time for a significant reform of the relationship between central and local government? Are you happy with the services delivered by your local authority, or do you think they should do better? Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.